I'm out here on my balcony this afternoon because I want to illustrate something to you that I first thought about when I was on my balcony a few weeks ago, and I noticed something that made me think there's more in store. There's more in store for you, for me, for all of us. And I want to just share with you a few thoughts that I had about that. Starting off by saying that there's a saying in English that talks about limiting something, putting a limit on something. You say you draw a line in the sand. And it means that you go up to a certain point and no further. You can't go beyond that line. It's almost as if there's an invisible wall that's been built up instead of just simply a line having been drawn in the sand. And that line denotes a no-go area. But when I was looking out from my balcony a few weeks ago, outside our house, I noticed that there's a line in the paving of our driveway. You see, when we first moved in here, we paved our driveway, and now looking at that line, it makes me think of the unlimited generosity of God, who gives freely without having to be asked, because that's his nature. He just loves to pour out his blessings on us as we're his children. And I look at that line, which indicates where the entrance to our property used to be. You see, when we moved in here, we put a gate and we paved and we fenced around our little piece of land, the little piece of land that surrounded our house. But a few years later, we were presented with the opportunity of extending our piece of land. Now, we hadn't ever thought about that. We hadn't planned for it. We hadn't ever imagined it. We'd not asked for it. We hadn't asked for the property in the first place. It was an inheritance. It was just given to us. So we were feeling already very blessed. But when we had this opportunity to extend our property, obviously we had to move the gate further back and we had to extend the driveway. So we paved the driveway, the second half, the same way that we'd paved the first half. But obviously we'd had to start off where we'd left off the first time, and that inevitably created this line. So I'm always reminded of where the gate used to be, where our entrance used to be, that now has been moved back as we extended. So I don't know really if that line is a starting line, if it's a finish line. It really depends on your perspective. But what it makes me think about is the fact that we might think we've come to the end of something. But until God says that we've come to the end of something, we really can't tell. We really can't decide until God has decided. With him, there's always the possibility of receiving so much more. And that's what I want to talk to you about. Like I said, we'd never entertained the idea of extending our property. We put limits on things. We tend to limit God by a lack of faith, by a lack of expectation. It's not really that God is limited. God can't be limited because God is God. But we limit what we can receive from him. We limit our expectations by having a small faith. So our lack of faith limits us, what we receive. It doesn't limit God. We declare so many times closure on something before time. God has no boundaries. God breaks boundaries. We read in Genesis in chapter 13, the Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had separated from him, "Lift your eyes now. Look from the place where you are, eastward, westward, southward, north. For all the land which you see, I give to you and to your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants could also be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and width, for I give it to you." There's always more in God. Our faith can always grow. There's always more to learn. We can always deepen our relationship with him. His love never fails. His mercies are everlasting. His compassions are new every morning. His loving kindness is everlasting. His word, his promises are forever. His truth and righteousness are eternal. His kingdom has no end, and his covenant with us is everlasting. Everything about God is limitless. He wants to bless us with a double portion of his goodness Isaiah 61 says he multiplies his blessings to us. He doesn't just give us what is coming to us, that one portion, our portion. He wants to double the portion that he gives to us. He's the God of abundance. He's abundantly kind, merciful, compassionate. There are hundreds of verses in the Bible that talk about the abundance of God and the abundant blessings, provision, love, joy, peace, forgiveness, redemption, grace, and of course that abundant life that he wants us to enjoy in him. God abounds in goodness and in power. And a definition of abundance and abundant is something that is more than enough, more than is necessary. See, God isn't limited in his generosity. He doesn't just give us what we need. He delights in abounding himself of his gifts, of his provision. Think about the young King Solomon when he first took the throne and he prayed. He asked God, even if God had said, ask me whatever you want, he asked God for wisdom so that he would be able to reign in the right way. And this is what God said to him. In 1 Kings we read, chapter 3, I will do what you've asked. I'll give you a wise and discerning heart so that there'll never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you did not request, both riches and honor, so that during all your days no man in any kingdom will be your equal. So, if you walk in my ways, keep my statutes and commandments, just as your father David did, I will prolong your days. So, Solomon had asked for wisdom, for discernment, and God gave him that, but he also gave him more. He said, moreover, I'll give you what you didn't ask for. Already the wisdom and the discernment that he gave to Solomon was abundant. It was so that he would have been unique in the whole of history. But he gave him even more than that, riches and honor that Solomon hadn't asked for. A simple reading of the Bible and looking at those terms, abundant, abundance, abundantly, abound, it helps us to expect, it raises our faith level to expect so much more from God. Not really expect more from him in material terms, not really expecting him to give us more, but it raises our expectation level to expect to see more of what he can do. Really, not perhaps in a sense with our eyes, but realizing that he is able to do so much more, infinitely more, far more, exceedingly abundantly more than all we could ever ask or imagine, as the Apostle Paul says in Ephesians 3, verse 20. Paul's praying that God would grant to the Ephesian church, according to the infinite riches of his infinite glory, to be strengthened with might through his Spirit in the inner man, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to, listen, comprehend with all the saints what is the width and length and depth and height, to know the love of Christ which passes knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. And such extreme abundance, I think, would make us pretty invincible. We wouldn't fear anything. We'd be fazed by nothing. We'd attempt great things for God just because we realize and we comprehend how great and limitless is his love towards us. But how could we? The apostle says in the very next breath that the love of Christ is beyond knowledge. Our finite mind can't ever understand or grasp the infinite. So, nevertheless, Paul prays that the believers be filled with all the fullness of God. And I ask myself, but is that even possible? Is it possible? In 2 Corinthians 9 verse 8, the same Apostle Paul exuberantly states that God is able. Jesus said, whatever is impossible to man is possible with God. And Paul said, God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. He is able to make it all abound to us, but not for our own sakes. That's one thing that I notice. It's not for us. God wants us to abound. But in what? In riches, in wealth, in material things, in wisdom like Solomon? Not really. That's not God's final aim in pouring out his blessings to us. He delights to do that. He delights to pour out his justice, kindness, his righteousness on his children. But there's a higher purpose in everything that God does. It's not just about us. He desires that we may abound in every good work, so that we can imitate Jesus, who went about doing good, it says in Acts chapter 10. In other words, we are blessed with every blessing to be a blessing to other people. God's supreme desire, over and above blessing each one of us individually as his children, is to reach the world with his message of love and mercy and justice and salvation. And he wants to use us in that. He wants to use us as examples. He wants to use us as channels, as instruments, as his representatives, showing the world what God is like, showing his goodness. In Genesis chapter 12, going back to Abraham, God blesses Abraham, and he says, I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So whether we can comprehend it or not, whether we can get our head around it or not, whether we can grasp it or not, that doesn't really matter, because the fact is, this is truth. So all we need to do is act on it. We need to trust. We don't need to fear anything. We don't need to be fazed by anything. And we can attempt great things for God, because there is more in store. We don't need to draw a line on the sand. We don't need to limit God in anything, and we don't need to be limited ourselves by our own lack of faith. You look at that line, is it a starting line? Is it a finishing line? I believe that it's a line that shows us how much more there is in store for each one of us. God bless you.